It was early springtime and the strike was on. It drove us miners out of doors, out from the houses that the company owned. We moved into tents up at old Ludlow.
Ο πατέρας μου ήρθε εδώ το 1903. Είχε γεννηθεί στο Μουζουρά, Χανίων, Κρήτη.
Both my mother and father's parents immigrated to the United States from Crete.
My dad is Joseph Kalidas. He came to America in 1910 and worked in the coal mines in Utah and Colorado for 68 years.
You'd kill our children, dug us a cave that was 7 foot deep, carried our young ones and a pregnant woman down inside the cave to sleep. That very night you soldiers waited till all us miners was asleep. You snuck around our little tent town, soaked our tents with your kerosene. You struck a match and the blaze it started. You pulled the triggers of your Gatling guns. I made a run for the children, but a firewall stopped me. 13 children died from your guns. I carried my blanket to a wire fence corner, watched the fire till the blaze died down. I helped some people drag their belongings while your bullets killed us all around.
American labor history has always been full of violence. It was not until the Industrial Revolution, however, that we would see class struggle in a way that would be familiar to our understanding today. In eastern industrial cities in America, as soon as there were workshops and factories, there was resistance against the new forms of economic and social repression that went along with that type of production. So factory women who worked in the Lowell, Massachusetts mills organized collectively for better conditions. In New York, there were working men's parties, there were labor riots, there were bread riots. By the 1860s, however, people in the United States began to embrace ideas that we would now recognize as anarchists.
May Day, which is celebrated everywhere in the world except in the United States, began in the United States because of a labor rally in which there was bombs set off, and the police said the anarcho-socialists did it. The Homestead strike put the state against the workers in the steel mills. The railroad strike was stopped once because the president drafted all the railroad workers into the army and said, you got to work or else you're guilty of treason. So labor relations in America have never been gentle. It's a cliche among historians that the winners write history. And so what's happened basically is that this violent American history, and particularly for us, the Greek history, has been pretty much lost, or was lost, for like 50 years.
My father came through to the United States when he was 17 years old. He came as an illegal alien through the port of Galveston, Texas.
My father's family emigrated from Greece to New Mexico and to southeastern United States. When they arrived, they were recruited to work in the coal mines.
They would take them up through the state of Texas and get them into the mines of New Mexico. And some went into Colorado, some went into the state of Utah. That's where most of the immigrants from Crete started in the mining business.
From 1900 to about 1920, at least 350,000 Greeks left Greece proper, and probably another 100,000, maybe 200,000 from Ottomans, Italians, and other passports, because the Americans count people by their passports. They were miners, railroad workers, construction workers, and lumberjacks.
I think immigrants from any part of the world were seen as just expendable labor, that there was no shortage of workers. You know, the company was actively recruiting workers from foreign countries. First, they had recruited in Northern Europe. When those people went out on strike in 1903 and left the coal field, then workers from Southern and Southeastern Europe were brought in.
Greeks were not welcomed in general in the United States. Native-born Americans thought that all the immigrants were taking their jobs away. And the Greeks somehow managed to get classified as the lowest form of European, and maybe not a European at all. In the West, where they had railroad gangs, 20, 30, 40 people work on a gang to do tracks and do other work. The Greeks were not allowed to camp with other Europeans. They were forced to camp with the Asians, which in this case tend to be Japanese. And of course, they always had the most dangerous jobs, which is dynamite.
It often has a kind of economic meaning. That is, the poor, the workers in factories and mines, they are beneath us. If they rise economically, they will become white. And there have been interesting studies about how various immigrant groups have started out being viewed as non-white, and then as they've acquired wealth and status and power in the United States, they become white.
The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, otherwise known as CF&I, began in 1872 by a man named William Jackson Palmer. Palmer's dream was to make a railroad line that connected Denver all the way south into Mexico. The only way to do this economically in the 1870s was to build the rails yourself. So Palmer came out to southern Colorado from Pennsylvania, and he chose Pueblo to be the site to build his steel mill because of our geographic location to all of the natural resources that were needed for making steel, for making the railroad tracks. The steel mill, from its very beginnings, was set up as a vertically integrated company. And this is when the company owns the method of acquisition, production, and distribution of its products. So, for example, in order to have steel, you had to have access to minerals, and the company owned and operated 62 different mines and quarries throughout the life of the company. The most famous owner obtained the company in 1904, and his name was John Rockefeller Sr. He then gave the company to his son, John Rockefeller Jr., in 1905 to control the operations of the company. At that time, the company had about 10,000 people on their payroll.
The mines were operated in what were called company towns. Company towns were basically captive towns. The miners would work for scrip. Scrip was a form of a negotiable instrument that was paid to them in lieu of money. The scrip was only negotiable in company stores. The miners are paid by the ton. The weights were always set up to cheat the miners.
They didn't pay you with dollars. Δεν πληρώσανε τους μιναδόρες με λεφτά. Ήταν script, χαρθιά. And they had to go to the company stores to buy. My father bought a pair of shoes one time in Raton, New Mexico, and he was fired from the mine that he worked in because he bought the shoes there.
The way that it would be calculated on the books would be in a fashion that the miners were always indebted to the company store. They were always indebted to the company. They never were on the good side of the ledger. And because they were always owing money, their scrip was always insufficient to pay the debt that they owed to the company store. They would be forced to continue to work the mines and to be in a form of indentured servitude.
Where it's not slavery, but everything you do evolves and runs around the company store and the company mines.
The miners in company towns lived in company housing. The coal company owned the housing, and they could only live in the housing so long as they were working the mines and working for the coal companies.
I lived in those company houses. There were usually 2 or 3 rooms, had outdoor plumbing. You had to bring your water in from a well, and that's how they lived. Coal stoves or wood stoves, whichever, but you didn't have anything else. When we lived up in Royal, it was nothing more than a little old teeny shack.
The Tabasco mine was anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 feet deep here, where they mined the coal, and it ran all the way down to this area, and this was the company headquarters area. In back of me, you can see some of the remains of the housing, the company housing, and this was all done ethically. Basically, people would settle with their ethnic group, whether it was Mexican or Greek or Italians, a lot of different ethnic groups here.
I'll see my woman Saturday night. I'm 900 miles from my home.
They bring a narrow gauge railroad track that was on the road above us, and they would bring a steam engine down, a steam jenny they called them, and they'd hook that steam jenny up to these big wheels that you see here, and they would pull the ore carts out of the mine shaft. The donkeys would drag them up most of the way, and they would pull them the rest, and then they would load the ore cars that would be sent down to the head of the canyon, about 2.5 miles, down to the tipple house. But once they got in the hole, once they're in the mine, then they had to take care of. They had to get the supports in. They had to get that on their own. And of course, some of this rock is good and some of it's pretty soft, so you have to put those supports close together. And that was all done on their own, for their own safety. The company did not recognize that as a danger. And they certainly didn't pay them for that work either.
If that train runs right, I'll be home tomorrow night, 'cause I'm 900 miles from my home. And
the death rate in Colorado's coal mines was 3.5 times the national average in the coal industry. And the U.S. average, that national average, was already high among industrialized nations that mined coal at the turn of the 20th century.
Το πρώτο μεταλλείο το οποίο επεσκέφθην ήταν το Clear Creek της Ιούτας. Εν θα συνήντησα μόνον Κρήτας και Λευκαδίους. Δια να φτάσω στο μέρος στο οποίο εργάζοντο, έλαβε χώρα οδηπορία υπό την γην 3 τουλάχιστον μιλίων. Αλήθεια, αισθάνθην φρικίασιν κατά την υπόγειον εκείνην εκδρομήν. Το σκότος πυκνών μας περιεκάλυπτε και το νερό επάγωνε τους πόδας μου. Η υγρασία και το ψύχος κατά από την γην είχαν κάτι τι το εξαιρετικόν αφότι ποτέ αισθάνθην, είχαν κάτι το συγγενές με τον θάνατον. Με τα αρκετήν οδηπορία ο συνοδός μου έδειξε στο βάθος προημών κάτι μελανάς σκιάς ρυθμικός κινουμένας, τον οποίον η μαυρισμένη μορφή, τα λαμπερά μάτια και το απαραίτητον φως στο κεφάλι έκαμε την εντύπωση κατοίκων του Άδου.
The sun would barely have come up. Their wives had to, if they had wives, they made breakfast, they ate, it was still dark. They would go into the mines in the morning and they would come out at night. They never saw the sun.
Lord, Lord, and I ain't gonna be treated this way.
Mining conditions for the miners were terribly dangerous. The miners were working with coal dust, which many people don't understand how explosive and dangerous and flammable coal dust is.
And a lot of them were ill from the coal dust itself. It's called black lung disease. A lot of my dad's friends died of black lung disease. And when my father passed away, he was 81, and we had him do an autopsy, and he had black lung disease because he worked in the mines for almost 30 years.
Ο παππούς σας το ίδιο. Είμαι πολύ μικρός τότε, σας, 6 χρονών. Και τον επλάκωσε ένα κομμάτι κάρβουνο. Και τον πήγαινε στα σπιτάλια και φτιάξανε το πόδι του λιγάκι. It got poisoned. Λοιπόν, το κόψανε την πρώτη φορά από το from the ankle down. The second time το κόψανε halfway down the calf. The third time they cut it 3 inches below his knee. And that from that time on, he remained that way the rest of his life. Uncle Chris made him an artificial limb out of a chair leg. And he wore that artificial limb in the mountains all the time. You had to be real careful not to step in soft dirt or on a loose rock. So that's the way it was.
In 1922, my grandfather, Mathios Milanakis, had 2 molars extracted. And because he was a miner and wasn't viewed with great value by the coal company, the instruments were not sanitized, and he contracted a staph infection. He lived 10 days. He died October 22nd, 1929. In 9 of those days, he continued to work the mines, even though he could barely walk. He died the 10th day.
Επισκεπτομένοι αυτούς εις τα σκαλίβαστον και φιλοξενουμένοι παρ' αυτόν, είχαν την ευκαιρία να παρακολουθώ τα της εργασίας των, να μανθάνω τα των μισθών των, να ακούω τα παράπονά των προς τους επιστάτες των έργων αυτών. Ενθυμούμε ένα κριτικάκι 6 πόδας υψηλό να κλαίει σαν μικρό παιδί όταν μία αφηγείτο πώς τους μεταχειρίζεται σκληρός, απανθρώπος, ο φύλαξ, όταν μου έλεγε πώς τους βλέπει ως εγκληματίας ο επιστάτης. Μόνον εκείνος ώστις δεν γνωρίζει τον Έλληνα και αγνοεί ότι ούτως εξαρτά δυστυχώς την ευτυχία του από το τι θα πει ο κόσμος, από την ιδέα την οποία έχει ο γείτον του δι' αυτόν. Μόνον εκείνος δεν είναι εις θέση να κατανοήσει τον πόνο του γενναίου κριτός, του συναισθανωμένου την ηθική κατάπτωση να εργάζεται και ζει μεταξύ λαού, ο οποίος με τα περιφρονήσεως τον ατενίζει.
At the turn of the century, many immigrant groups were seen as less than human. as being expendable as workers. So this is what they were up against: dangerous conditions in the mines, and then an American ideology that saw their lives as less valuable in some instances as even the life of a good mule.
Workers in America were largely, when my grandparents came here, they were largely powerless. They would hire goons that would become the quote National Guard, and they were nothing more than hired guns to go in and repress the miners through the use of force. If a miner spoke out, he would be simply thrown out of town. If he became too aggressive, he'd be shot. And, you know, that's just the way it was. And there were no laws on the books to protect the miners. The laws that were on the books were basically such as to be unenforceable. If a miner were able to get into court, which rarely happened, the courts were stacked against them. The judges were selected by the mine owners and by the powers that be that were aligned with the mine owners. And if you were even able to find a fair judge, you couldn't find a fair jury. Moreover, the legislators were in the pockets of their mine owners and the influential financial interests throughout the western United States. And any reform wasn't going to take place because you could never get the legislature to pass fair laws.
The injustices were unbelievable because anything that they did that the company perceived to be wrong, they were thrown out. Now you have to imagine, they come to this country from a foreign country, they have their families, they have their children, they have nowhere to go, they don't speak the language, they work in these horrible conditions, and yet they stay there because there's no alternative.
They had no other income, and the mine owners knew this, and they took advantage of them.
In 1914, the economic terrorist was Rockefeller Jr. He believed that he could cut off the lifeblood of these folks who were struggling for a living by forcing them to live in the cold, but they endured.
John D. Rockefeller had the first sociological department that was based on a racial conception of the labor force. People who should manage the towns that they set up and the company were Anglo-Saxon males, obviously males, but they got Anglo-Saxon women to become their sociological department. They based the towns on a segregated town structure, ethnic groups divided.
The coal strike of 1913-1914 didn't happen in a vacuum. It was actually part of a series of strikes that had gone over the previous several decades, most of them small. There had been a major strike in 1903, which led the coal operators particularly to decide to change their employment force, their workforce in the mines. They began intentionally recruiting, sometimes illegally, workers from Europe, Italy, Greece, other places around the lower southern Mediterranean, and brought them into the mines, intentionally bringing in people of different ethnic backgrounds, different languages. And the reasoning was, if they had all those languages in the mines, it would make it harder for the union to organize. How do you organize a workforce when the workforce can't speak to each other?
Some of the immigrants, the Italians, for example, the northern Italians, for example, and immigrants possibly from Hungary, from Russia, had been introduced to ideas of class struggle. The Italians had several radical and anarchist papers. There was revolutionary activity and there were labor movements in these countries. But the Greeks were from villages, and their view was much simpler. There were the rich and there were the poor. There were officials who oppressed them, but I don't think at that time they had developed concepts of class. There was very little labor activity in Greece in 1906. It was maybe just beginning just a little bit, as I understand it. But the minute the guards of the mine owners start shooting at you, you begin to understand what class is all about.
during the strike, all of the other issues that were on the table could have been settled. The one thing that the companies refused to budge on and the workers refused to budge on was their right to organize themselves and to have a union represent them. And that was the driving, propelling force.
Bob come in from somewhere and started a union with, they call it the Western Federation of Miners, sick benefit things. And if you get sick, you get $1 a day. And then I got in touch with Bob. And then when he got ready to United Mine Workers come in there, he just turned the whole works over to United Mine Workers. So I talked to the fellow that was connected with the union. I said, you think we ought to do something with these men? He said, will you? I said, well, I'll try. And I took the job to organize the miners.
The United Mine Workers of America was the union that organized the mine workers in southern Colorado. The UMWA was part of a larger federation of unions called the American Federation of Labor. And by labor union standards, in the industrialized world, AFL was a pretty conservative organization. They were most interested in organizing skilled workers, and so skilled workers at the turn of the 20th century meant men, and it meant the native born and white. The United Mine Workers, although it was a member union in the AFL, looked at things differently. And in part because they grew out of this much more egalitarian and inclusive organization called the Knights of Labor in the late 19th century.
But one of the things that they recognized early on was that there would be no discrimination, whether a race, color, creed, national origin. They knew that, you know, in order to have a union, they had to be all inclusive. The miners had some disputes with management. They tried to form their unions prior to the 1913, but they had very little or no success.
In 1910, United Mine Workers started a strike in the northern part of Colorado. That didn't go very well. They had very little effect on the coal operators. So they decided that they wanted to expand the strike to the southern Colorado zone, and that began in 1913. To do that, they realized they had to get these different ethnic groups and languages on a common ground. So they began appointing bilingual miners and union organizers who would be sort of the point men for the different ethnic groups. And for the Greek miners, that was Louis Tikas. They called him Louis the Greek. Earlier in his life, he had run, I think, a coffee shop in Denver, and they got involved in the coal mines and then in the union movement. So he was the Greek liaison between the Greek workers and the United Mine Workers management. And he was sort of the pivot point for that ethnic group.
There were miners from 22 different countries involved in the strike, and organizers like Louis Tikas worked very carefully to bring these very diverse miners with different languages and different cultures together for one cause, for the cause of the union. And Tikas was an extremely talented peacemaker. He could come in and get different groups to come together and work together.
During this time period, the United States had a domestic anarcho-syndicalist group called the Industrial Workers of the World. What people sometimes don't know about Louis Tikas is he had a cafeteria, a little coffee house, across the street from the IWW Hall in Denver. Now, the IWW Hall was like an American cafeteria. So you can imagine the Greeks on one side of the street, Americans on the other side of the street, both of them upset with the government. I think they had more than a few conversations. This doesn't mean that Tikas was an IWW. It means that those ideas were circulating, and the Greeks knew about them very well. There was another battle just before Ludlow called Bingham Canyon. And the Greeks were major participants in that strike. And they wanted to get rid of the labor boss, and they wanted raising wages and all kinds of things labor wants. And many of the strikers were Cretans. Now, the Cretans had come from their battles with the Ottomans not so long ago. And when the miners brought out the National Guard, the Cretans went to guerrilla warfare. And they went into the mountains with their rifles, and if you were a scab trying to get into the mine, they shot at you. For quite a long period, they held the mountain against the American National Guard, State National Guard, and they won the strike. So when the strike broke out in the coal fields in 1913, it was part of this long-term trend of militancy, and this particular strike had a strong Greek element.
The strike began in September, around September 23rd in 1913, and it was just pouring awful weather that day. And over 10,000 strikers and their families came out of the canyons. Most of them were living in what are called closed camps, which meant they lived on company property. So once they went on strike, they no longer had access to the company-owned houses, so they were evicted, and they knew they were going to get evicted. That was part of the planning. The Mine Workers Union had bought thousands of tents and put them up in 8 or 9 different locations out on the plains away from the mines, near where the railroad lines went. Ludlow was one of those.
I remember when they evicted my dad out of the town at that time. Well, to get out of there, they just took his furniture and threw it out on the street. It was in the fall, and it was sprinkling, like, you know how it is in the fall, raining. Well, he had to go up there. There used to be some farms around Lau, and we'd go up there and get a team of horses and a wagon. Come down with it. We loaded all of our furniture. It was raining. They just had the tent colony set up in Ludlow, too.
And ain't gonna be treated this way.
The organization of the colony was very well ordered. One assumption that the colonists were up against at this time in American history was that they were uncivilized and presumed to be violent. Especially the Greeks were assumed to have a particularly violent nature. So we believe that the colony was organized in such a way, ordered streets, a very prominent doctor's tent, a large communal tent. We believe all of this was part of a strategy to communicate to the outside world that these were civilized people and that they were very well organized. The colony was also oriented at a 45-degree angle to the road that ran by it, and we think this had something to do with allowing the people in the colony to have better visibility with people coming down that road so that they could see people approaching from some distance away.
When they set up the tent cities, they set up unsegregated tent cities. So it might be true that Greeks and Italians would be in their own family units, but they would be situated very close to other ethnic groups. So they weren't segregated as they had been in company towns. That was strategic, and it worked wonders. Mary Thomas, who had been in the camp since September of 1913, talked about this amazing development over the course of the winter during the horrific snowstorms, how people learned to be together and to help each other.
Most strikes are seen as a male enterprise, but Ludlow was distinctive for the importance of women and children. Women and children marched with the men in Trinidad. They were probably guilty of hurling insults at soldiers. In the tent colony, we believe that women maybe were most important in bringing these different ethnic groups together, that they were largely responsible for making sure that relationships between the different ethnic families were smooth and harmonious.
Mother Jones, in her first speech that she gives in September 1913, in which she says, "This is what I've been arguing since 1903, that the only way you can confront the extreme power of Rockefeller, of all the mine owners, is to unite and to get rid of ethnic differences."
There's a hill between Aguilar and Ludlow that we call it Mother Jones Hill. She got up there and made a talk to all of them. If you're too cowardly to fight for your rights, there are enough women in this country to come and beat the hell out of you. If it is slavery or strike, I say strike until the last one of you drop into your graves. We are going to stand together and never surrender.
The strikebreakers came in on the train at the 6 o'clock train at night, and we would hear the train would come up from Walsenburg, go around the hill, and we would hear the train go toot, toot, toot. We'd all go down to meet the people coming in.
We used to go up in the track and stop the train. Stop the train, and then we go see all the boxcars and open them all up and see if there was scabs in. Because they used to bring a lot of them in with the trains in, then they put them in a boxcar, and then they close the door. And we made this, the conductor, or whoever it was, to open that door, see if there was any strikers in there, any scabs in there.
When the strike began, the coal operators horrendously misunderstood the background of the men that were in their mines.
Rockefeller thought that he had a bunch of immigrants working in the mines that would do anything they're told, that would capitulate to his being, that would buckle under to any authority. What he didn't realize is the Greeks especially, had been fighting in the Balkan War.
So they knew how to use rifles, they knew how to fight, they knew how to engage in guerrilla combat, they knew how to be effective soldiers. And that completely caught the mine operators by surprise. It was an aspect of their work for us they didn't understand.
There were militia that were part of the government, and there were goons that these guys hired to be there with them. And my father shot one guy in the thigh with a pistol and took his rifle, and we have that rifle.
The company had hired a detective agency called the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, which is essentially a company of thugs. They're incredibly violent. From the beginning, they were breaking into people's houses, searching for weapons, that sort of thing.
That's the way they used to go around in the truck and machine gun to the miners' camp.
Who?
Company guards.
Is that what they call the death special?
Yeah. There's a machine gun set up right in there.
The first act of violence happened before the strike even began. A United Mine Workers organizer named Gerald Lippiot got involved in a confrontation in the streets of Trinidad and was shot dead by a couple of Baldwin Felts private detectives that had been hired by the coal operators. And that was almost around a month before the strike began.
Me and George Harmon, I think, was the first guy that was killed in the southern Colorado coal strike. We got off the train in Trinidad and walked up to Commercial Street, and we started up Commercial Street, and we got on going up through there, and a fellow by the name of Lepia, who had come down from Denver. He was an organizer. And two fellas walked out with guns out from the pawn shop there. Stepped out with guns and stopped Lepia. But me and George walked on up the street a little. We hadn't walked very far. We started shooting. and they shot Lepia down, and he fell in the middle of the street, and that was Belk and Belcher.
They were all over the streets of Trinidad. The most notorious of the gunmen was a man named Belcher, and the miners had decided to kill him. They had decided at a meeting of miners that this man had to be killed. He was terrorizing miners and their families, and there was no way to cope with him.
Belcher was killed coming out of a drugstore there when they had a big parade or something going on in Trinidad. I wasn't there at the time, but I heard it. And he walked out of there, and he had a cigar, and somebody plugged him in the head.
Of course, if the right words were used, they said it's a good thing they killed him, they should kill the rest of them. That was the slogan, you might say, at that time, because the miners, of course, were certainly against them.
As the violence was escalating, the companies wanted the National Guard to be brought in as a peacekeeping force, theoretically. But what they really wanted to do is they wanted to get out from underneath having to pay for all the mine guards for no protections. They wanted the state to pick up that cost. So in late October, as the violence was getting bad, Governor Ammon sent in the National Guard to establish peace in the district.
The National Guards were created explicitly and consciously back in the 1870s to break strikes. And for the first 50 years of their existence, all the way up into the 1930s, that's pretty much all the National Guards did in the industrialized states in the US. It began in 1877 when there was a strike nationwide of railroad workers, and the United States Army broke that strike, put down that strike. So in its aftermath, though, the state officials and business leaders started thinking about, if such a situation should arise again, what are we going to do? Because they couldn't rely on the Army. This was not the Army's job, and the Army did not want to do this. And so what they came up with was a system of National Guards.
However, at the time, Colorado's state budget was in very, very bad shape, and they had trouble paying the troops. So as the soldiers weren't getting paid, they were drifting back to their homes and their lives back in Denver and other cities. And as they were drifting away, the coal operators realized they needed to, put some money into this thing. So they began paying for the salaries of the National Guard. And as they were hiring more guardsmen, instead of drafting people who were part of the National Guard's structure in Colorado, they began hiring the mine guards. So you can imagine the frustration among the miners when the people that they were fighting against at the mines, the mine guards, the thugs, were now wearing government uniforms. They were wearing the uniform of authority. And at that point, the miners realized they were on their own. Even the government wasn't going to help them in this situation.
A guy that was company guard put the state uniform on to be called the National Guard. Yeah. And those kind of guys want to keep peace.
I'm the youngest sibling of Joseph and Anna Mazanatel. They resided in a tent colony in Forbes. Forbes is about 4 miles from Ludlow. It was sacked and the tents destroyed on the 10th, 11th of March. My mother had just given birth to twins. The family had gone to Trinidad for the burial of the twins. She was quite ill and not knowing if she was going to make it or not in those days.
So while they were gone, all of the tents were torn down but 2, mine and another one. So the militia came up to my place then, and one of them wanted to know, what I was and all. And then he said, well, we ain't going to fool tearing this, and we'd light a match to it. So there was another soldier. He said, I won't burn it. He said, I'll kill you before you hurt her. She's there sick in bed and they're burying her twins. You're not going to hurt her. So whoever he is, I always said a prayer for that boy. I don't know if he's alive or not, the soldier. One was helped me and the other might have been gone.
In December, a horrific snowstorm hit Colorado, 4 or 5 feet of snow in places, and that just put a damper on everything. Nobody could move. As that thawed and the weather changed, a bunch of federal investigations began. There was a congressional committee that held hearings in Denver. With all that attention, both sides decided to behave themselves. Neither one wanted to be seen as the bad guy or as the instigator. So everybody kind of laid low as this was going on. Come March or so, things have been so quiet for so long, Governor Ammons decided that it was prudent for him, okay for him, to move some of the National Guard troops out of the strike zone and send them back to Denver.
And still somehow this battle broke out that led to this horrific massacre. I think to understand that, we need to understand just how poisoned the relationship had become between the National Guard on one side and the striking workers on the other.
What the company did is they brought in this fellow Linderfelt, and he was a ruthless, kind of sadistic fella, and they set up a machine gun. They took it up to Water Tower Hill there. From Water Tower Hill, they had command of the whole area here, not only the town of Ludlow, but also the striking miners' encampment. They could shoot right down into that.
The Guard responded to a complaint that one of the strikebreakers had been kidnapped and had been taken into the tent camp. Louis Tikas, the Greek organizer for the United Mine Workers, came and met with the Guards, but somebody started shooting. Nobody knows who.
John Lawson was the head guy of the union, and myself. When they called us up and told us that fight had broke out in Ludlow, John and I was the first two who got in the car and jumped in the car and started for Ludlow. When we got within 1.5 miles of Ludlow, we couldn't get in. It was surrounded by the Guards already from all the directions.
It didn't take very long before a gun battle took place between the strikers on this side and the Guardsmen across the way. The Guardsmen had a machine gun mounted on a nearby hill, and they began firing kind of indiscriminately into the camp.
They started shooting down at the strikers down the tent colony. They put a machine gun. And they started to hit the number 1 tent.
When they started to shooting and stuff, they go down in these cellar seats.
All them women and kids, they hid out in the basement.
Ultimately, late in the day, a railroad train came through and stopped, giving the miners a chance to escape to the east. They took their families and they fled into the arroyos and out onto the plains. When that happened, the National Guard came in and set fire to the tents in the camp. There were women and children hiding underneath one of the tents right over here, and they suffocated.
You struck a match and the blaze it started. You pulled the triggers of your Gatling guns. I made a run for the children, but a firewall stopped me. 13 children died from your gun.
At the end of the day on April 20th, after the tents were on fire and the women and children had been killed, Louis Tikas and 2 other male strikers were rounded up in the tent colony. They were captured by the National Guardsmen who were torching the tents. And they were brought to a guy named Carl Linderfelt, Lieutenant Linderfelt. It was a very hard argument between Tikas and Linderfelt. And at the end, Linderfelt grabbed his rifle by the barrel and swung it and cracked open the skull of Louis Tikas, took out about 1.5 inch chunk of flesh from his skull, knocked him on the ground. Linderfelt later said he ruined a perfectly good rifle over Louis Tikas' head. He had absolutely no concerns about Tikas' health. Linderfelt then walked away to where his commanding officers were and some other military people were. And a few minutes later, gunshots rang out. Tikas had been shot 3 times in the back as he lay on the ground, and 2 of the strikers were shot and killed at the same time. So these were 3 men, 3 labor organizers, 3 striking miners who were summarily executed by the Colorado National Guard.
Linderfelt, well, he was a son of a bitch.
He was laid on the railroad track for 3 days, his body, before they moved him. And he had one of the largest funerals in Colorado history, 1 mile long, not with cars, but with people walking 2 by 2.
Η σωρός του Τίκα είχε τοποθετηθεί μπροστά σε ένα βωμό με πολλά κεριά. Ο ιερέας με τη βοήθεια του Πέτρου Κατσούλη, του νέου ηγέτη της ελληνικής αποικίας, έψαλε τη λειτουργία και ο Κατσούλης τον συνόδευε. 3 φορές ο ιερέας φίλησε τα μάγουλα του νεκρού ηγέτη. 3 φορές έχρισε το μέτωπό του με κρασί. 3 φορές του έριξε χώμα στο πρόσωπο. Όταν η σωρός μεταφέρθηκε έξω από το εκκλησάκι, 488 Έλληνες μπήκαν σε γραμμή μετά την νεκροφόρα. Τα χρώματα της Αμερικής υψώθηκαν και η νεκρική πομπή ξεκίνησε μέσα σε απόλυτη σιωπή. Διέσχισε τη Main Street και περνώντας μπροστά από το αρχηγείο των United Mine Workers, κατευθύνθηκε προς το νεκροταφείο των υποτών της Πυθίας. Πριν την κηδεία, 4 Έλληνες μπήκαν με τα μουσκέτα τους στο εκκλησάκι. Έβγαλαν τα καπέλα τους και δίνοντας όρκο στο νεκρό να εκδικηθούν το θάνατό του, χτύπησαν 4 φορές τη γη με τα κοντάκια των όπλων τους. Και μετά έκαναν μεταβολή και βγήκαν έξω.
My grandfather, Nicola, was the older brother of Charles Costa. Charlie and Nicola came to America in 1893 with their mother. They went into the mines when they were only 12 years old. As they grew up, they found that they were trapped, really, in a life of industrial slavery in the Ludlow coal fields. And they decided that the only way that they could gain the respect and dignity that they deserved as workers was by joining a union. And Charlie became a union organizer in Aguilar and worked with his wife, Sedelina. They paid for their activism with their lives. Charlie was killed at Ludlow. He was shot through the head. Sedelina, she was in the black hole at Ludlow, and she was full-term pregnant. She gave birth at the time of the massacre, so she lost her life at the age of 27 along with her just-born baby. Her children, Lucy was killed at the age of 4, and Onofrio was killed at the age of 6. My grandmother went to identify the bodies. Sedelina's body was bayoneted, that it had been bayoneted. And she never lost that memory. It's kind of haunted her the rest of her life.
It took a couple days for the women and children and other victims who died that day to be buried. As that was happening, John Lawson, the head of the mine workers strike force in Colorado, issued a national call to arms, essentially telling American working people that the government was not going to defend them, had to defend themselves, and to bring their guns to Colorado and make a stand.
The first words that came from the Union was, there will be no peace as long as there is no justice. And people were willing to take up arms at that point to vindicate their union.
Οργανώστε τους άνδρες της κοινότητάς σας σε ομάδες εθελοντών για την προστασία των εργατών του Κολοράντο από τις δολοφονίες ανδρών, γυναικών και παιδιών από ένοπλους δολοφόνους που υπηρετούν τις εταιρείες Άνθρακα με το πρόσχημα της πολιτιακής εθνοφυλακής. Συγκεντρώστε για την άμυνά μας όλα τα διαθέσιμα νόμιμα όπλα και πυρομαχικά. Κρατήστε όλες τις ομάδες σε ετοιμότητα. Η πολιτεία δεν μας παρέχει καμία προστασία και πρέπει να υπερασπίσουμε μόνοι μας τους εαυτούς μας, τις γυναίκες και τα παιδιά μας από αυτούς τους δολοφονικούς εκτελεστές. Δεν επιδιώκουμε σύγκρουση με την πολιτεία και δεν σκοπεύουμε να παραβούμε κανένα νόμο. Σκοπεύουμε να εξασκήσουμε το νόμιμο δικαίωμά μας ως πολίτες, να υπερασπιστούμε τα σπίτια μας και τα συνταγματικά μας δικαιώματα.
It was a war. 20,000 rifles were sent, Winchester rifles were sent to Colorado by friends of the miners in Colorado to protect themselves against gun thugs, company guards, state militia. They had actual war in southern Colorado.
Miners themselves, they got mad. I contend it was never a war until that point in time. And then they said they had enough of this, and they attacked the National Guard, the company guards, and the Baldwin Phelps. And it took them 7 days to drive all of them out and to basically take control of Los Animas and Warfano County.
All of the testimony from the period talked about how the Greek Union men, Ludlow, were the most skilled in terms of their military strategy and how their military competence was far higher than the American militia.
What saved many lives. Εγλιτώσανε πολλοί γιατί οι Έλληνες είχαν όπλα.
Από το βράδυ της Παρασκευής, όταν ο Big John Brown οδήγησε τους απεργούς του από τα Black Hills αθόρυβα μέσα στην πόλη του Trinidad που κοιμόταν, η απεργία, ένα καζάνι που βράζει από καιρό, είναι έτοιμη να εκραγεί. Η πόλη του Trinidad θα είχε τιναχτεί στον αέρα αν δεν υπήρχαν οι ήρεμες φωνές του Αρμάντο Πελετσάρη, ηγέτη των 1000 Ιταλών, και του Πέτρου Κατσούλη, διάδοχου του Λούις του Έλληνα. Ο Πελετσάρη αξίζει την προσοχή μας σήμερα, γιατί η μοίρα μπορεί να του επιφυλάσει αύριο να είναι αυτός που θα δώσει τη διαταγή στους 1000 Ιταλούς του να επιτεθούν στο Τρινιντάτ και να το καταστρέψουν. Εάν δώσει αυτή τη διαταγή, δεν θα είναι για εκδίκηση για το Ludlow, αν και πιστεύει πως ο άνθρωπος που ξεχνά δεν αξίζει να λέγεται άνθρωπος, αλλά γιατί πιστεύει πως αυτοί που κάνουν κακό πρέπει να πληρώνουν και η μοίρα διαθέτει πολλούς και διαφορετικούς εισπράκτορες οφειλών. Όσο για τον Κατσούλη, ηγέτη των 500 ατρόμητων Ελλήνων που δεν έχουν τίποτα να χάσουν στη ζωή, έχει ακόμα δάκρυα στα μάτια για το χαμό του Λούις του Έλληνα. Ο Κατσούλης είναι μελαμψός. Τα αγγλικά του χρωματίζονται από την προφορά της ελληνικής γλώσσας. Τα χέρια του είναι τεράστια, γεμάτα ρόζους, σαν τα κλαδιά ενός αιωνόβιου δέντρου. Οι Έλληνες, που αποτελούν τη ραχοκοκαλιά και τον μυϊκό ιστό της απεργίας, πονάνε ακόμα αφόρητα από τα γεγονότα του Ludlow, σαν ανοιχτή πληγή που της έχεις ρίξει αλάτι. Ο Κατσούλης, που εξελέγει στη θέση του Λουίς Τίκας, έχει καταφέρει να κρατά τα πράγματα υπό έλεγχο. Θα κερδίσουμε αυτό τον αγώνα, λέει. Τον έχουμε ήδη κερδίσει, σαν Έλληνες.
At one point there, after the massacre at Ludlow, the miners took Trinidad. And my sight, the thing I see, is my father, who was a very young man. He took my mother and me in his car, open car, and he drove proudly around Trinidad. And on each corner, there stood a stalwart miner with his red bandana and his rifle. And as we drove by, they all saluted my father like a general.
Το στρατόπεδο του Σαν Ραφαέλ Χάιτς που διοικούν αυτοί οι άντρες έχει άρτια ρημοτομία. Κάθε σκηνή έχει εκχωρηθεί σε τόσους άνδρες όσοι μπορούν αξιοπρεπώς να χωρέσουν μέσα της. Υπάρχει το αρχηγείο του διοικητή, όπου στιβάζονται ψηλά τα κυβότια των πυρομαχικών, με ένα τηλέφωνο στερεωμένο στον κεντρικό του πόλο, με στρατιωτικές καρέκλες για τους επισκέπτες. Κάθε φορά που ένας απεργός εμφανίζεται στην είσοδο, χαιρετίζει, εισέρχεται και στέκει προσοχή. Δηλώνει την αποστολή του, παίρνει τις διαταγές του και αποχωρεί. Χρόνος δεν σπαταλιέται. Η πειθαρχία είναι ο στόχος των ηγετών του συνδικάτου και προσπαθούν να την κάνουν μέρος της καθημερινότητας των απεργών.
After the massacre took place, the Greeks and a few other people formed a guerrilla group and they burned down and destroyed 3 or 4 other mines. Okay, there were more people killed.
So they had a red handkerchief on their neck, they got a rifle, and marched through Trinidad and went straight up the hill. See? So when they went up, the first mine that was meet was Forbes mine. And it started to rain over there.
In one place called Forbes mine, they moved in and torched every building that they could reach. Some of the strikebreakers and the mine guards were holed up in the mouth of the mine. So the strikers couldn't reach certain buildings because they were getting shot at. When they encounter people who are shooting at them like that, then they return fire. So they wound up killing, I think, 9 or 10 people at Forbes. But their intent was to destroy property. They were just trying to hurt the coal companies as much as they possibly could.
United Mine Workers came in with supplies and more arms as well, and they started driving the militia out of this area and back towards my house about 2 miles up the canyon. And basically they ran the militia out of the county. And set up their own sheriff and judicial and basically set up their own little mini government here.
At its peak, the 10-day war, they call it, that followed the Ludlow massacre itself, the striking miners held military control of 275 miles of the front range of the Colorado Rockies. That's from the New Mexico state line almost as far as Denver. So they won the military fight against the National Guard. The shooting didn't end until President Wilson sent in the U.S. Army as a peacekeeping force. The United States Army as peacekeepers on domestic soil. The National Guard went back to the barracks in Denver. The strikers' enemies were the National Guardsmen at that point. So once the National Guard was removed from the district, the violence ended. The strikers no longer had an enemy to fight against.
Then they scattered, they separated to hide from the militia. My dad went to Fort Garland with another gentleman named Papadakis, Kostas Papadakis, and they stayed in Fort Garland for 6 months because they did not know that amnesty was declared. To the day my dad passed away, to the day he died, he did not like talking about what happened after the massacre because you have to understand they felt that they could someday be prosecuted for what they did. They burned down 4 to 5 mines. People died. You have to understand, you don't talk about that.
In 1914, capitalism had a name, and its name was John D. Rockefeller. And he was not an abstract force, he was an actual individual, and he lived on West 54th Street. For weeks and months after the Ludlow massacre, members of the Rockefeller family saw themselves besieged and surrounded and threatened by radicals in New York City and in their wealthy gated estates in the suburb of Tarrytown.
People marched up and down outside his office in New York. They had a mock trial where they convicted him of murder outside his home in North Tarrytown, New York, and he got terrible press for days, if not weeks or years, in the American media because people thought he was responsible for the deaths.
Meanwhile, very large percentages of the population sided with the radicals, agreeing that the Rockefellers had gone too far and suggesting that the time had come for serious social and economic reimagining of the social order. Three well-known New York City anarchists were working on an explosive device in their apartment in Harlem. On July 4th, 1914, 2 months or so after the Ludlow massacre, that bomb exploded prematurely and the three bomb makers themselves were killed. Everyone assumed that it was going to be used in an attack against the Rockefeller family.
Me as a miner, you know, I stand on these people's shoulders. You know, these children, you know, Louis Tikas, you know, they made life for me as a coal miner and as an American citizen a lot better.
It took atrocities like Ludlow, like the Schofield mine explosion, which killed hundreds of men. It took atrocities and tremendous disasters to get miner reform.
In the short term, it was a failure for the strikers and for the United Mine Workers. They didn't get any of their demands. But in the long run, Ludlow is important because it laid the seeds of change.
Helped really fuel pushes for the 8-hour workday, for child labor laws, for effective laws governing working conditions, and for union recognition.
It basically started a movement that it ended in 1935 with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act and gave workers the right to unionize.
In the present, U.S. workers have paper rights, but in practice, very few rights to protest. We have no rights to the streets. You know, we would get mass arrests just as they did in Ludlow in this time. And it's something that we only sustain this notion of rights as long as we don't use them.
Ever since then, history has sort of treated the strikers as victims in the whole coal strike. To me, those aren't the actions of victims. I mean, these guys were freedom fighters. They rebelled against a corrupt political economic system in violence, and that's a whole different argument as whether that is the right thing to do, but they stood up for themselves.
Well, Daddy died a miner, Grandpa he did too. I'll bet this coal will kill me before my working days is through. In a hole that's dark and dirty, an early grave confined. I plan to make a union for the ones I leave behind. Stand up, boys, let the bosses know. Turn your buckets over, turn your lanterns low. Fire in our hearts and fire in our soul. But there ain't gonna be no fire in the hole. There ain't gonna be no fire in the hole.
Greeks are very prosperous in the United States. So it's hard to remember that 100 years ago, 125 years ago, things were different. The community wants to forget it, and I think that's a mistake. When you forget things, they can somehow reappear in new form.